We're noticing a theme tonight.
Oh, are we?
We've been noticing a theme in some of the questions we've been getting lately.
Yes.
And we decided that maybe we should, rather than answer one question, we should answer the theme of questions.
Well, it's funny because we're like, I feel like we often answer similar questions and we're like, well, maybe this is because this is either very alive in the collective consistently or this is sort of our shtick. I
Both.
don't know.
Yes, and.
Yeah. Both. That's
That's
a both and, as you would say.
that's a both and. And I guess don't fight
Yes.
the inevitable, right? Okay.
Mm,
So let me do my best to kind of pull out a couple bullet points and then obviously help me here out of a couple of the questions that we've gotten rather than just read one because number one, they're kind of long, but number two, there's a few of them, right?
okay.
So a couple of them that have come through, they've all been from women.
Okay.
All of them have been married for upwards of 15 to 20 plus years,
Mm,
now separated, right?
mhm.
Um, in one case, there is obvious infidelity, like it's been discovered, it's part of the separation. And the other one, it doesn't seem like that. But either way, the relationships are on the other side of separation,
Okay.
right? There are children involved in all the questions we've gotten. Most of the kids are older though, 16. There's one that's 11, one that's 19. So range of ages, but nothing that I've seen that's like little kids. We've been together for
Mm,
20 something years. At this point, I'm assuming our kids are older. But the biggest thematic, I think, in some of these questions is I'm in this space. I don't want to be in this space anymore. What do I do to move forward? Um, and literally, they've asked any suggestions, any advice, any clarity would be appreciated. Like these are all the terms that they're asking. And so, what am I missing? Anything?
yeah. No. I was wondering about like reading a portion of one of them, but I guess you gave a pretty good synopsis, so maybe we don't need to. Um,
Where do I start? What can I do? Right? I want to move forward. Like these are some of the snippets of language. I suppose that might be helpful to hear.
yeah, I think that what's coming into my head is that thing of like, ain't nothing to it but to do it. Like there's
Oh,
no
wait, say that again.
ain't nothing to it but to do it. I think those are lyrics to an '80s rap song. I don't
Well,
know
I don't know what
whose.
song it is, but I like it.
Yeah. Um, those who know that song are like laughing at me right now, but in all seriousness, I think that what we're talking about is certainly that really uncomfortable muck of what we would talk about in the context of a liminal space where I'm not the thing that I'm becoming, I'm not where I'm going, but I know that I can't stay where I've been anymore. And so it's a threshold of initiation. I am crossing the bridge into another phase of self, into another phase of my life, and it is terrifying because I know that I need to take a step, but I don't see the step yet. I don't know what
Mm,
this is going to look like. I don't know who I'm going to be in this next phase of my becoming. And this is where all of the work that I think we constantly are talking about and the tools that we talk about like acquiring, I think there is nothing that makes that any less scary. It becomes the space of I just have to take that step and trust that the path will appear. And that is well, terrifying and deeply
mhm.
destabilizing to the psyche because I have no idea, you know?
Yeah, the other thing that's coming up for me, I just did a coaching question. I do these like coaching on demand, right? Where somebody can like
Mm,
send in an audio question and I'll respond via audio. And I just
mm,
was doing one this morning and it was around the fear of a parent's death. And while not
mm,
connected necessarily to this topic, it does feel connected in that one of my responses to the way that I was talking about it in this message was the suffering that this situation is going to cause. Number one, there's
mhm,
already suffering, right? And the suffering that this situation is going to cause is inevitable.
mhm,
So there is no way around the suffering that will come from the loss of a loved one, the loss of potentially the loss of a marriage, at least these relationships that we're referring to. And sometimes by avoiding the thing, right, doing the thing, you're actually just prolonging the suffering itself. So by not working on wrapping your mind around and sitting with this is the inevitable suffering that's about to come, I believe that we actually do ourselves such a disservice. And I'm not saying there's not a reason for it. Obviously, there's fear and there's all of these things, but that act of avoidance prolongs the suffering for us. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. And I do think in this context, it becomes important to hold what is a little bit different about the grief that comes from like loss of someone in their physical body versus the grief of an end of a relationship. And I
Mhm.
only say that because I believe quite often the story we tell ourselves about the quote suffering in that context is often much larger than, or we will believe it will be much larger than it actually is.
You mean in the
Meaning it
relational
becomes in
component?
the relational
Yeah.
space, right? Because so much of what we have been programmed to believe is this failure is going to
Mhm.
be devastating. This thing of being alone is going to be unbearable. And I think that one, all of that is arguable.
Mhm.
And it's not that there's not grief, certainly there is, but I do think there's more of a, well, I'll speak from a personal perspective. I think the way that I framed the end of my marriage in my mind really helped me to not experience what could have conceivably been suffering. And a lot of it was because we had lost someone literally 2 months before my marriage ended in his physical body. I'd experienced a death that was like
Earth
just
shattering.
earth-shattering to me,
Yeah.
like, I was so devastated to lose this person, and
Yeah.
I think framing it in my marriage ending in the, context of, like, "Well, he's not dying.
Mhm.
We're still in each other's lives, you
Mhm.
know? Yes, our relationship is changing form, but maybe we have an opportunity to love one another better as friends. Maybe we have an opportunity to see, like, how this is meant to evolve as it changes form, but for both of us, and I think there's something about, like, death of the physical body, if we can be really, really present with that. I like to talk to clients a lot about actually meditating on death on a daily
Mhm.
basis
Mhm.
that can bring a different reverence for all of the challenges of life. One, in a way that we don't take things for granted to the context and to the extent that we might otherwise, but also, um, that we just don't feel entitled to things in life in the way that we might if we sort of say none of this is promised to us. I
Mhm.
think, our friend dying really gave me like a visceral sense of like everything that I complain about, everything that I feel like I'm entitled to. Why am I more entitled to those things than he was? I'm not. And so I'm not entitled to having the certainty of my marriage. Life has decided that chapter is closed. And so I can be in resistance and really make myself suffer.
Right.
Or I can say, this is the hand I'm dealt?
Yeah, and I think that I mean, I wanna clarify that I wasn't in any way comparing the pains or the sufferings. I think it was just the
Yeah.
idea of, like you were saying, it's like if I pretend that this suffering's not happening, it's like I can either embrace it and move into it, which then moves through it at some point, or I can brace against it and just continue to stay in the path of it, right? Um, and it sounds like in all the variations of this question that we've gotten, the person, the woman that's writing in is very, very aware that the
Mm,
relationship is no longer, right? But what
mhm.
they're struggling with is like, now what? And I think the first now what would be what you and I are talking about, which is to really sit with, acknowledge, embrace, and allow yourself to truly feel the suffering of the reality that the way that it has looked, your relationship has looked up until this point is no longer. And
Mhm.
we've got to allow that reality to be present before we actually can take that next step.
Yeah. I think that there is, you know, a surrender and a moving into the space of acceptance that I'm hearing in both of the specific questions that you read. Like I am resistant to
Mhm.
being in the space of surrendering to what we are both clear already is. And to me, that is where suffering comes in. And so I know that sometimes it can feel a little bit cold when I say that. And I don't mean it that way, but what I mean is I think it's important for us to like this is where we challenge in the space of inquiry the
Mhm.
way I'm holding this, because a lot of
Mhm.
times the suffering comes from the story I'm telling myself about what quote should be happening that
Mhm.
isn't, what my life should be, that it is no longer going to be. And I think that's a very linear way of looking at life, a very like the structure is set in stone, that what has been is what will always be. And a more feminine principle of life is that life is always in the space of evolving and changing and growing and expanding. And if we hold that these type of changes with that lens, it becomes, if this is a life school, this next chapter of my life is calling me to learn some new lessons, right?
Mhm.
And one of them may be how to sit in the discomfort of being by myself right now. Big
Mhm.
breath, right?
Yeah, and also the 2 specifically that I read, another component to this is that in their own language, both women expressed that they were not happy before
Mm.
whatever catalyst, right? So, like, in one catalyst, it was infidelity, in one catalyst, it sounds like just the disillusion, but, or the dissolving, whatever word you wanna use, but both of them said that they were not happy in their relationship for years leading up to.
Oof.
So, there's something in that too, right? Like, I don't know, there's a few different things that come up for me around that. So, there's the component of, oh, what is the word? I'm trying to think of, like, the emotion that comes up. It's almost like you beat me
Martyr?
to it. Well,
Oh.
yeah, but I guess the first one, there's
Yeah.
that too. The first one that's coming up for me is around, like, we like to be the one to do the leaving. And
Hmm.
so, like, the fact that you did the leaving, like, how dare you? I was unhappy, and I wasn't the one that acted first. And so there's almost like a little bit of feeling slighted or like
There's a
one
little
upped
ego
ego
there.
for sure, ego, which I just think is interesting, right? Because both people are saying, by the way, I wasn't happy beforehand, but I'm still struggling with moving forward. And I just think that's interesting, like how much of this is ego around um and this might sound maybe a little callous, but like that you, for whatever myriad of reasons, didn't have the courage to do the thing that your partner actually did have the courage to do. And again, I don't, that sounds mean. I know courage does sound a little harsh, but for whatever reason, right? There's a lot of reasons why we don't, for the children, for the security, for the established relationship dynamic we already have, for the families, like whatever those reasons are, I'm not minimizing them. But there is a little ego in that this person took that away. Like this person acted before I could act. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, like, I'll be real, that did not occur to me at all, but I think that there's a little bit of, like, sometimes there's a more competitive energetic that people have in relationships. I witness this a lot in couples, that I don't feel as much of that. Like, my ex definitely probably felt a little bit more of that competitive energy, and I think there is something though in, well, a couple things about, like, I was unhappy for a very long time. I saw this meme and I was telling you about it the other day that said, "Isn't it funny that you, like, think of a time where you've ever heard of a woman having an extra family or another family, and that never happens, right?" And in one of those examples you gave me, this, the man in the situation was like with a friend and like keeps coming back and forth to her and the other family. And I think there's just a way that, to me, what I'm struck by is just the deep normalization of a lack of happiness for women, or a lack of contentment
Mhm.
in our lives.
Ooh,
And that, like, that that to me is what I'm so struck by when I hear both examples. It's like we have so normalized women who, like, their baseline is just like, this is life. It's just, I don't love my life.
yep.
Um
And how
and
dare this man reach in and say, I'm pulling the plug on this because I'm not happy.
absolutely. And I think that, you know, it is, like, I believe this is like the call of our times, of our generation, of us as women to put down, and when I said martyr, this false narrative that it is serving our children for
Oof.
us to stay in dynamics where we are miserable, and tell them, "This is in service of you." Like, thanks. I didn't ask you to be
To be
unhappy and
miserable.
do it for me.
Yeah.
And PS, that is an unbelievably unfair burden that we are continuously putting on our children. They feel like, one, that they're getting all of this messaging about, like, what it is to be in relationships, and we're just like normalizing a, like, baseline of discontent. But also, if the reason you've been here is to parent me and he's off there doing whatever he's been doing with other people, enjoying his life, what am I sort of equating that to mean about me and what I have
Yep.
robbed you of, you know?
Yep. And that it's my fault. right? Like, it's my fault that you're unhappy. I am the burden. If I wasn't here, you'd be happier. That's where so many of these like messages come from that we then as therapists are sitting across from people attempting to kind of unpack and rewrite.
Yeah, the mother wound is the patriarchal lineage of what happens to the children of women when those women stop fully living, stop embodying their feminine essence and radiance and life force and play and joy and all of those healthy qualities. What we pass down to our children is the belief life is suffering. It literally is. That's what they're inheriting.
Well, if we were to tell somebody, somebody says like, "Oh, what's some advice or what's some, direction? Any advice would be would be welcome." And we're sitting here saying, "You are in the liminal space. The in between is the most painful. It's the most uncomfortable, right?"
Mhm.
And think about the different ways that we've given you to reframe this situation, right? So through the lens of what is it that you're really doing or giving to your children, through the lens of embracing and recognizing the suffering and stopping avoiding it, but more like taking it on. The one of the other, I guess, I don't know if it's techniques or what I want to call it that I talk about with clients a lot of times is like we have this desire, first of all, as human beings, we hate the unknown, which I just find hilariously ironic that the universe then created us to be in a constant state of unknown.
Mhm.
But you cannot be on like if we're talking A through Z, you can't be on C and expect to be able to see what Z is or what X is, right? If you're standing on C, all you can look to do is look to D, and that's it. Stop trying to even see F or G. Like just look and see if you can figure out what D is. And D might just be calling a friend and going to have coffee. Like that might be what D is. I am in this space of suffering. Maybe I'm keeping it to myself. Maybe I'm not, processing it with people. Okay. D is going to be, I'm going to call a friend and I'm going to call a therapist. And that's what D is. And so that is your next step. Like that's what you do tomorrow. Right. Um, but you don't need to have your entire life, what it's going to look like for you a year from now, completely planned out before you do D. And I think sometimes that keeps us stuck because it's like
Mm.
we want it to be perfect or look a certain way. And so it's like that almost like paralysis by analysis in a way. There's so many things that I need to do in order to move forward that I just pull back and get overwhelmed and don't do any of them. And my suggestion is forget all of that. What is the next step? In support of yourself, what is the next step?
Yeah, and wholeheartedly am in agreement with all those tools, and I also want to offer the remembrance of bringing the focus inward and learning to
Mhm.
stay in your skin because,
Yep.
you know, a society that puts so much focus on the external will continue to say, and it's not that we don't need people because we do, and I like hear it
Mhm.
before people say it, and we are a society that in the context of like 12 steps, they talk about like spiritual bankruptcy. I feel that on such a like collective level in
Mhm.
terms of like our ability to have a relationship with our inner world, which to me is like our spiritual life. That's just like what we've gotten away from societally. It's like we don't know how to ride the waves of discomfort. And until we learn to do that, we don't understand that those waves pass. They don't
Mhm.
stay. And I'm
Not gonna
telling
kill
you,
us.
the greatest gift of my life has been the visceral learning that there is no feeling that will kill me. And I
Mhm.
remember moments of my life where I thought this this fear will kill me. And when you get to the other side of it and you're still there, and it was actually you that did it, nothing outside of you,
Yep.
but
Yep.
you rode that wave. There is a pride and a sense of self and an ability to live from the core of who you are that never, like, you can't unlearn that. You can't unsee that. And I
And no one
just
can take
think
that away.
that's right. And until we as a society learn more like to be in that space of the sacred solitude of like the first place I go, not even like maybe when I'm at my wit's end, whatever, whenever you get there, when you're ready, but that ultimately at some point it's between you and the higher you. And that to me is source. That to me is whatever you choose to call something greater than yourself that also lives within you. That is ultimately the fundamental relationship that I feel like we need to prioritize having a relationship with in a way that we have just lost track of, from my perspective.
Mm. Amen.
And that's about our fear of death, right? Like that is like that circles back to the annihilation. And like until we have that, I do think we continue to like defend against the fear of death, defend
Hmm.
against, and that's what that thing of the unknown, right? Like
Yeah.
death is the ultimate unknown. What happens when I leave this body? It's terrifying. Um, and I think we have to get into some sort of a relationship with what we believe to be true about what that is, or we will always cling to things that are ever shifting, ever changing, we can't control and try to control them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Maybe that's why that conversation I had this morning came up in relationship to this, because it does feel connected. You know, these fears are not in
Totally.
silos. These fears are actually all connected. And when you're doing the work of self and you're doing the work of who I am in relationships, what is my next step? I'm in this liminal space. How do I move forward? Like, just know that you're also doing the work on that larger component to self. Like, what is the highest self look like? You know, what does that highest self believe in? What is that highest self? How do they show up in this world? How do they
Mm.
show up in regards to somebody who potentially, quote unquote, betrayed you? Like, what does that highest self look like? Who do you want to be? Because all of these opportunities too in relationships give us an opportunity to challenge that, explore that, and decide on what that highest self is.
Yeah.
Mm.
We're like a society that doesn't have initiations anymore, as we would talk about from a depth psychology perspective. And like the initiation used to be how you go into the fire and are alchemized and come out on the other side changed.
Yeah.
But something we talk a lot about in the groups we run is that there are some fires that no one can go through with you. There are some ways that you have to be in relationship with yourself in a way that builds a sense of self-confidence that, as you said, can never be taken away from you. But I do think that is like a huge portion of the individuation process that we have just decided we're going to bypass and distract our way through. And, like there, I just did this workshop for a week at this place called Modern Elder Academy. And we were talking about a lot of these concepts around individuation and like how people so more frequently than past generations get to like their 60s and 70s and they've never had this process of individuation,
Mm.
mostly because we're a generation that hasn't been uncomfortable enough, right? Like we didn't have a Great Depression, we haven't had the wars that like so many of
Yeah.
these other generations went through, that were their individuation, that were their like we've lost everything and like but I'm still here. Like we just have been, in a lot of ways comfortable enough that we
Mm.
haven't like that any suffering feels like unbearable, right? It's like, and this is not me minimizing the suffering of a relationship ending at all, but I'm saying a lot of times, and John speaks to this, like a divorce does become the initiation in
Yeah.
modern day society because we haven't had any sort of initiatory process before that. And this is the thing where you're in the fire. Are you going to distract from the fire? Are you going to jump into a new relationship? Are you going to use everything outside of yourself to self soothe? Or are you going to stay with yourself and teach yourself, I got you. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere?
Hmm. Yeah. Oof. All right, y'all. I feel like we've given lots of tools on this one. We could go on and on, but I feel like this concept of like, what do I do to move forward? Yeah, we could go on and on.